11th day, upper wind month, 1 CE, 1800 hours. Ugh, I'm going to die. I need a drink. Draudilin placed her pen in its inkwell. She flexed the fingers of her cramped hand, reviewing what was somewhere past her 100th missive to the various organizations and districts of Orichalon. This particular one was to be sent to the Guild of Shipwrights, whose members had been working non-stop to repair the damaged vessels moored at the city's piers. She frowned at the childish structure and vocabulary that filled the first page, which amounted to a letter of recognition and encouragement. Writing in that style was always well received, but the fact that it was well received felt strange to her as the years and decades went on. It was no secret that the Queen of the Draconic Kingdom had reigned over her country for longer than most of its citizens had lived. Despite this, no one ever questioned her youthful appearance. Instead, they embraced it. On a certain level, she could accept that what they saw was what she was, after all. On other levels, however, she could only scratch her head over how people stopped thinking once they were satisfied with whatever conclusions they came up with. Surely one would realize that, despite appearances, decades of experience would result in a more mature personality and outlook? Having someone as old as herself acting as if she were a child should surely be seen as bizarre. She was in fact certain that her subjects understood this. Usually one wouldn't accept the policies and decrees of a 12-year-old as prudent or wise, especially when those policies and decrees had to do with running a country that was in a constant state of being attacked by its predatory neighbors. Maybe they thought it was all the work of the royal court and her ministries. No, even the royal court and her ministries saw her that way. Something was just broken in all of their heads and she just went along with it because she was ultimately responsible for how things had turned out. Draudilin set down the cover letter and picked up the next page. The efforts of the city's shipwrights had been focused on the fishing fleet for the first 2 days. Now that many of the fishermen were out working again, she felt that the bulk of the shipwrights' efforts could be focused on getting the transport fleet afloat again. With the western wharf being torn down to make room for the Sorceress Kingdom's exclave, plenty of materials were made available to effect repairs. After ensuring that the wording of her missive wouldn't lead to any strange misinterpretations or wild results, she added it to her pile of completed work. Ina picked up the missive to review. Draudilin stretched and reached for her cup. She sighed inwardly as her lips touched the rim and she remembered that it was filled with water. During the day of his arrival and half of the next, Sabos served wine whenever she requested a drink. Then someone pointed out that it was unseemly for the queen to be drinking so much. When Draudilin noted that she wouldn't remove her poison immunity item and thus couldn't get drunk, she was told that if she was going to drink wine as if it was water, she may as well drink water instead. With the state of her finances as it was, she couldn't present any rational argument in favor of her continued consumption of wine. The most annoying part of it all was that it went from all wine to all water. "What do you think, Lady Yorstin?" "I think it's wonderfully written, Your Majesty," Ina smiled. "The shipwrights will surely weep in gladness and work 5 times harder. If they work 5 times harder, we are certain that they will die. Maybe we should rewrite." Ina sped away with the missive, disappearing from the throne room. Draudilin glowered at the hole in the door, then let out a resigned breath. "You must find these all laughable, Sabos." "On the contrary, Your Majesty," Sabos replied, "I believe that anyone would be pleased to receive recognition. This should be especially so if that recognition comes from the one who rules them. Still, there should be limits." It occurred to her that with Ina gone, she was alone with Sabos. She fussed with her scant outfit and checked her hair. Sabos had stated that he didn't care how she looked, but she still needed some angle of attack. Since she would be constantly working with the court, she ended up appearing as her original self. With that being the case, she just decided to be herself. While Draudilin was of the mind that men would prefer women who were more substantial in a physical sense, she also thought that her original self wasn't terrible. There was probably some appeal to it. A capable, industrious queen possessed of decades of experience and wisdom, yet blessed with a youthful appearance. Yes, surely that would be attractive. She was single, as well. Plus, she was a sorceress. A very rare type of sorceress that couldn't normally be born. It all had to count for something. Then again, men in the north tended to dislike women with power. Unless it led to some sort of sexualization. Fantasizing about having strong women somehow finding a man irresistibly attractive and bearing children for them was fairly common, as far as she knew. Her physical strength was not much more than what could be considered normal for a human, so maybe her plan was doing the opposite of what she intended. She was just groping about blindly, hoping her methods would bear fruit. "We will be visiting locations around the city starting tomorrow," Dylan said. "Is there any particular place that interests you?" "There is no need to change your plans on my account, Your Majesty," Sabos replied. "They are just random visits. We will go everywhere eventually, so anywhere you choose will serve just as well." Silence fell between them. Dylan resisted the urge to look over her shoulder to gauge his expression. Sabos spoke again just before she did. "The summer before the last," he said, "I visited the capital of Riastais to perform certain duties. Every day, after I completed my tasks, I would simply choose a direction and walk. I believe this allowed me to see much more than what I would have had I decided on any particular destination." "So you chose the journey over the destination?" "Just so, Your Majesty." Dylan grew heated at the warm smile in his voice. She didn't know whether he was telling the truth or evading the question within her question, but, either way, it was skillfully played. He was strong, yet humble, which was rare. Furthermore, he was gentle, patient and kind. Sabos was best described as a good man, but, at the same time, that description felt woefully inadequate. Ina returned to the throne room in the company of Countess Corlin and her delegation. With their ladies' maids came one of the teal-haired half-elf maid commanders from Baroness Zaradnik's general staff. They offered their courtesies before moving on to the purpose of their visit. "Your Majesty," Countess Corlin said, "we've come to deliver this evening's updates from the Northern Front." Dylan checked the time. It was almost exactly 1 day from Baroness Zaradnik's last audience. "While we appreciate a sense of consistency," Dylan said, "please do not trouble yourselves if there is little to report. The campaign has just begun and you have many other matters to attend to, yes?" "Of course, Your Majesty," Countess Corlin inclined her head. "There were just some matters that we thought best addressed by the royal court." "Very well," Dylan nodded. "What matters do you have to bring to our attention, Lady Corlin?" The Countess looked up at her, withdrawing a folder from the magical container at her waist. "Foremost is the reinstallation of Blighthold's civilian administration, now that the city has been secured." "Huh? What?" Dylan nearly jumped out of her throne as Ina exploded beside her. "The girl's uncle never did that." "Lady Corlin," Ina said, "did you just say that Blighthold is back under the Draconic Kingdom's control, or has weariness led me to start hearing things?" Countess Corlin glanced to her side. The half-elf maid came forward and lowered her head. "Lady Austin," she said, "Blighthold never completely left the Draconic Kingdom's control, but it has now been secured by our forces. We've already started delivering supplies to the city. The Beastman clan occupying the province has mostly been destroyed and their remnants are fleeing toward the Sealang River. Once we've ensured that no harm will come to your subjects as the Beastmen retreat, Baroness Zaradnik will be heading to Haifat with an infantry company to relieve the defenders. We estimate that the entire province will be cleared of Beastmen within 2 days." Ina staggered over to her desk and flopped into her chair, staring blankly at nothing in particular. Dylan turned her attention back to the Sorceress Kingdom's delegation. The women of the delegation simply stood there, attentively awaiting her reply. When adventurers reported their success to her, it came in the form of self-aggrandizing tales that stretched events out for everything they were worth. The theocracy quietly came and went most of the time, not caring much about what anyone thought. Her military commanders promised many things and she could only smile and express her hopes, knowing that it was almost likely in vain. Rarely, if ever, did anyone try to involve her in their efforts, nor were the results of those efforts ever so swift. Though the Sorceress Kingdom's delegation expressed their desire to work together with her, it still felt odd that they did. On one hand, it felt nice to do more than simply wait and hope for good results. On the other hand, the speed at which they accomplished everything gave her the creeping feeling that she would soon be buried in even more paperwork. It was likely that they were merrily dragging her off to some bureaucratic hell. "While your demonstration in the capital gave us a sense of how powerful your forces are," Dylan said, "we expected more time to have passed before they achieved the objectives outlined by Baroness Zaradnik yesterday evening. A province is quite large, after all." "I can't say that things have gone exactly according to plan, Your Majesty," Commander Lynam said. We've learned many things, but there is still much to understand about our adversaries. Fortunately, we have been able to employ what we do know in our favor. Still, the results are the results. By the measures of the common man, your chief of staff would be a legend in the making. Commander Lynam's lips twitched upwards. She was plainly pleased with the praise heaped upon her mistress. I believe that my lady would deny that she is anything exceptional, she said. That her work is only one small part of a greater effort, one that involves not just those of her soldiers and general staff, but the hundreds of officers under her and the army groups in the Sorceress Kingdom who are all contributing their observations and insights to our campaign in the Draconic Kingdom. That she is merely the endpoint of all that, just a captain carrying out her orders on the field. There is clearly more to it than that, Draudillan said. It may be that it is as you say and what goes on results from the work of many, but it is still very much dyed in her color. This sort of thing is difficult to fabricate and even harder to conceal. It was a simple matter to force superficial change with overwhelming strength. It was another matter entirely to precisely shape events to achieve lasting goals. The half-elf maid-come-commander quietly lowered her head and returned to her place. Draudillan turned her attention back to the rest of the Sorceress Kingdom's delegation. Speaking of difficult things, she said, we recall something extremely annoying being said just now. Something about the reinstallation of Blighthold's civilian administration. Yes, Your Majesty, Countess Corlin replied. I believe what we've seen is indicative of what we will find elsewhere, so extremely annoying will become, whatever comes after extremely annoying. The invaders have culled the population according to their usefulness as livestock. Draudillan's brows drew together at the revelation. That is not how they usually act. They are usually more indiscriminate. Based on what I've read of past incursions, Countess Corlin said, Your Majesty should be correct. We believe that it has to do with the nature of their invasion this time. According to the records in the Royal Archives, they would simply gorge themselves and take as many as they could before leaving. Now, they are intent on conquest. You mean to say they are in the process of transforming the Draconic Kingdom into a farm, Draudillan said. We knew that the occupation would lead to this, but we did not consider that the beastmen had put any thought into how that would be done. Since they indiscriminately slaughtered her subjects in their raids, she thought it would be much the same for their current occupation, that people would be indiscriminately tossed into farms regardless of their vocation. All that they would need to do was liberate her subjects and sort them out. Her stomach churned as she thought about what usefulness as livestock entailed. So when you say reinstalled, you are speaking in the literal sense? Yes, Your Majesty. The administrative staff of Blighthold is missing, at best. Almost all of the city's guilds have been subject to the same treatment. Our forces sweeping over the province haven't been able to locate a single noble. Even village chiefs have been culled. So anyone even remotely resembling a bureaucrat or clerk has been eaten. Anything resembling anything they deem useless, Countess Corlin replied. Which is everything aside from what is absolutely necessary to sustain a human population. The only exception to this has been merchants, which we believe is the result of common customs shared around the world. Great. She wasn't sure whether she wanted to cry more because she had lost so many people or because there was no one to replace them with. To be certain, it at least seemed that the Draconic Kingdom would be able to survive, but its structures of governance would take generations to restore. If that's the case, Draudillan asked, how is order being kept in Blighthold, if at all? A man named Nedim who claims to lead a certain Balak family is currently occupying Blighthold City Hall. He claims to be in control of the city. Oh, him. We suppose that makes sense. A hint of surprise traced over Countess Corlin's neutral mask. Your Majesty is familiar with the person in question? She asked. Draudillan nodded. He is, Gem. We would say that he is the master of the syndicate that manages Blighthold's underground, but that is not quite right. His organization regulates the gambling dens, brothels, fighting pits, slave markets and other establishments of that sort. Then to be clear, he is not some sort of criminal overlord? None of the establishments that we listed are illegal in the Draconic Kingdom, so the Balak family is generally treated in a similar fashion to an official guild. The lot of you have some fairly amusing expressions at the moment. Countess Corlin and her party remained silent for several seconds. Draudillan smiled slightly. It was the first time their age and inexperience showed through their mantles of competence. She gestured to the long table along the carpet to their right. Please, have a seat, she said. We feel that this will be a long discussion. Say boss, would it trouble you to serve refreshments? It would be my pleasure, Your Majesty. Once everyone settled down, Draudilin took a long draught of her wine and cleared her throat. Our understanding is that the Kingdom of Reistais is a country where the establishments we mentioned are often, if not always, operated by the criminal sort. Would this be the source of your discomfort? Yes, Your Majesty, Countess Corlin replied. Not only are we aware of what you speak of, but we have witnessed the effects of such operations in person. And with the Sorceress Kingdom, Draudilin said, came the power and authority to sweep all those undesirable elements away with impunity. Is that right? I wouldn't quite put it that way, but that was the end result. Draudilin drained her cup and set it lightly on the table at her arm. She leaned back against her throne, quietly regarding the three noble women seated at that table. The Sorceress Kingdom is strong and prosperous, she said. This much is abundantly clear. With so much power and wealth, one may order the world around them according to their whims, but how many countries do you know of that can do this? One by one, they shook their heads. Draudilin nodded. That's right. Very few, if any, countries can do whatever they wish. Most must pay a not insignificant price for any action that they take. Thus, they must consider the costs and benefits. We believe most choose violence. They choose to aggressively subdue or remove that which they consider undesirable. This might be considered natural. Those who rule cannot suffer the existence of those who defy them, after all. One may also argue that the long-term effects of those undesirable elements are detrimental to the country as a whole. But it does not have to be that way, Draudilin continued. Perhaps this fact is lost on those who live in peaceful lands, but the Draconic Kingdom is very lean. We do not have the luxury of making enemies out of potential allies, and internal conflict only weakens us against the guaranteed threats that lurk just beyond our borders. Borders that you have probably by now noticed are not very defensible. In the Draconic Kingdom, humanity is united because we always have a greater enemy at our gates. There must be some way to avoid such harmful compromises, Your Majesty. Who says that what they do has to be harmful? Who decides they must be enemies in the first place? A ruler uses whomever can be used. Some are quite heavy-handed when it comes to that, but there are many ways through which to create allies. Those allies will corrupt your nation from within. Countess Corlin's expression hardened, her amethyst eyes glinting coldly in the torchlight. She was like one of the theocracy's angels, a personification of good that was ever ready to strike down evil and injustice without a shred of mercy or remorse. You speak as if the world is set in stone, Lady Corlin. Well, that may be true in various ways, but not in this one. It is far easier to influence an ally than it is to coerce an enemy, especially as individuals of our leanings. So Your Majesty maneuvers people into positions where you can more easily influence them, Lady Gonye said. Then you slowly transform them into what you desire. It is not so straightforward as one-sidedly changing people like some sort of transmutation spell. Consider it more along the lines of a craft. We believe that you are especially well equipped for this sort of thing, Lady Gonye. Baroness Gonye shrunk in on herself. Me? Umu. In truth, we are certain that you have all done it before. You are simply blinding yourself to the full extent of your capabilities. Could Your Majesty provide us with an example that we might be able to understand? Examples should be plentiful, given your circumstances. Any time you wish to enact change amongst your subjects, there are common measures you take, yes? Say, a new agricultural technique or some promising vocational field that you wish to promote in your territories. You mean incentivizing or promoting development? Countess Wagner asked, or creating value that can be recognized. Those are a few ways, yes. But that's normal stuff. It is, for us, Draudilin told them. There is something else to it, however. Others may try, you can even tell them exactly what to do, but they will not be able to succeed as quickly or to the same degree, if at all. This may sound strange, but what people are capable of depends on what they are. A farmer may watch a blacksmith work with adamantite and do exactly as they do, but, in the end, the farmer will not be able to do anything with an adamantite bar. So it is with a great many things, but some are easier to recognize than others. It is a bit strange, common knowledge accepts many fantastic phenomena, yet, at the same time, it dismisses others as if our meager understanding of the world dictates reality. She gauged their reactions as she spoke. A slight smile crossed her lips. "We see that you are already aware of this," Dylan said. "At least to some extent. Anyway, most who do what we speak of have no idea what is going on, but it works nonetheless. The problem is that they tend to only use it for a certain side." "What do you mean by side, Your Majesty?" Countess Corlin asked. "Most commonly, it is divided into things that are clean and things that are dirty. Or it might be more accurate to say acceptable and unacceptable. They are limitations placed upon you by culture, morality, perception and preconception. Some things are normal, while others are unthinkable. Often literally. Since the Sorceress Kingdom is a nation of many peoples, anyone who has employed these capabilities with other races has already crossed the line of what the majority of humans in the theocracy's part of the world would consider unacceptable or unthinkable." "Oh," Countess Wagner said. "In that case, you're right about Gonye. She does dirty things with other races all the time." "Oof." Countess Wagner crumpled forward onto the table and stayed there. "In that case," Baroness Gonye said, "what did you do with the Balak family?" "Nothing out of the ordinary," Dylan replied. "I fostered what stirs the heart of any human. Pride. Recognition. Worth. A sense of identity and belonging. Normal stuff, as the late Lady Wagner put it. None of it is hollow, of course, everything is real and precious enough to fight for." "Then how does the Balak family fit into everything?" Countess Corlin asked. "As we said before, they are treated as a sort of unofficial guild. Guilds are regulatory bodies. The Balak family oversees all of the establishments that we mentioned in Blighthold. We could never really come up with a decent name that would cover everything, so it was left as it was. They ensure everything operates within the bounds of the Draconic Kingdom's laws and, like any other guild, including the temples, they are responsible for maintaining order within their membership. They are especially important after major raids. The Draconic Kingdom's economy is not so robust that it can simply shrug off the disruptions that the beastmen cause. When times are hard, men and women both do what they must to survive. Guilds like the Balak family ensure that things don't get out of hand. They serve an integral role in the cycles of predation that the Draconic Kingdom is subjected to." "Does that mean there's an organization like this in every province?" "There is," Dylan nodded. "We would not be surprised if they still exist even in the cities longest occupied." "I see." Baroness Zaradnik seems intent on making use of them. "Will there be any problems with that?" Seeing that Lady Zaradnik appears to be the ruthlessly pragmatic type when it comes to warfare, we are not surprised that she would ask. These groups will help to an extent, but the chains that bind them to society consist of obligations and values that keep them from straying too far from their place. "I will let her know, Your Majesty," Countess Corlin said. "Since we've broached this topic, could Your Majesty be so kind as to inform us of how the various institutions and organizations in the Draconic Kingdom have adapted to the cycles of predation? While much about your country appears familiar to us, it has become apparent that what lies beneath the surface of everything has resulted in something entirely foreign." "We would not go so far as to say things are entirely foreign to you here," Dylan replied, "but we understand what you are trying to say. Generally speaking, things are practical here. We cannot afford wasteful ceremony or hollow pretense, as anything of the sort would result in liabilities that we can ill afford." Countess Corlin produced a stack of blank paper and some sort of writing instrument. It looked like a fountain pen, but the design was unknown to her. "Due to our assumptions about the Draconic Kingdom," Lady Corlin said, "our procedures in Blighthold were inefficient. Interactions with the local merchants were manageable, but Baroness Zaradnik spent a lot of time wandering around trying to puzzle out how the city was ordering itself. The survival of authority figures and even entire institutions is not guaranteed, and those that are lost will be nearly impossible to replace in the short term. We would like to understand the processes through which your country will restore itself." "To what end, Lady Corlin?" Ina asked. "Is it not enough for you to interact with our merchants? The people will sort themselves out with the assistance of the court. Recovery efforts will proceed apace." "What are the tasks usually handled by the administration, Lady Yostin?" Countess Corlin asked. "Even the guilds have lost their support apparatus. There will be no reliable coordination or direction of effort. Each citizen will be attending to their own matters. We cannot expect everything to simply put itself back together of its own accord, unless the Draconic Kingdom has unfamiliar processes that address this." Draudilin frowned internally as she watched Ina bristle out of the corner of her eye. It seemed that her Prime Minister had reached the limit of her tolerance for the Sorceress Kingdom's representatives. "We understand that you are trying to help, Lady Corlin," Draudilin said, "but matters of civilian administration are the purview of our government. Baroness Saradnik has been entrusted with a certain amount of authority out of necessity, but the solution to the problems that you are currently attempting to address is not beyond the capabilities of our people. We will assemble a team from the capital to deliver to Blighthold. They can be delivered, yes?" "Of course, Your Majesty," Countess Calling lowered her head. "We have a transport prepared to be used at your convenience for this purpose. I apologize for overstepping my bounds. Please forgive me for my indiscretion." Draudilin nodded quietly and they moved on to the next topic in Countess Callin's report. Her eyes went from the trio from the Sorceress Kingdom to Ina before she let out a quiet sigh. For all of their excellence, they were ultimately still young. Educated, skilled, eager and inexperienced. "I suppose I'll be playing the mother for the foreseeable future." 11th day, Upper Wind Month, 1 CE, 2000 hours. Ina settled into a leathery couch with a long sigh, closing eyes weary with strain and sleepless nights. "The invincible Ina slouching in defeat," a voice said to the side. "A painting of this scene would surely be one for the ages." Her eyes rolled over to a figure framed by a window of the lounge. Seated on a tall stool was Salacia Sorul, dressed in the pale silks that she was wont to wear when off duty. She had an artist's sigh and a dancer's demeanor, and her talents had earned her a place in the palace staff. Now, however, the scion of House Sorul was left at a loss with their world upended. No readings or recitals, no plays or grand balls. Only 17 years old and already a relic of better days. To Salacia's credit, she had not abandoned hope for the future, instead applying herself where she could and securing a place as the interim Minister of Public Health and Wellness. It was a role that suited her well. She was on good terms with the temples and her bardic leanings allowed her to communicate effectively with the public. "The impertinence of our guests is becoming too much to bear," Ina said. "They grow bolder by the day, sticking their prim little noses into our business. I envy our queen for the grace in which she handles matters." "Those noble women are of merchant stock," Salacia shrugged. "I don't know what you expected. It was inevitable that they would start grabbing at whatever they could. Everyone was shocked and appalled when they asked Her Majesty for a piece of the city. Their trying to justify everything only makes things worse." Ina shook her head, sighing again. They were, of course, grateful to the Sorceress Kingdom for the aid that they had provided. When they started pushing for all sorts of things so shortly after they arrived, however, it was difficult to retain composure. It was akin to fending off a pack of hungry beastmen with a dried-up twig. "They should have just stayed in a merchant inn if they wanted to act like that," Salacia sniffed. "Roaming around like they owned the palace. If you have enough energy to complain, you should help poor Delaros in the front." They turned to the new voice, finding Zoran and Amod entering the lounge. The two footmen were adorned in the tan and indigo garb of militia officers, which was thoroughly caked in dust from the dry city streets. "Don't you dare sit down," Salacia said. "I just cleaned up these couches." The two men stopped. They exchanged a glance before heading to the bar instead. "You men have been out playing at being soldiers," Ina said, "so you don't have to watch those women prancing about the palace." "We're not playing at being soldiers," Zoran frowned. "If you'd like, we can trade places and you can see what we must go through firsthand. I for one wouldn't mind sitting around the palace." "You mean flirting around the palace?" Salacia said. "You and your goons must be ecstatic with the new flowers to pluck. Exotic foreigners, no less." "Hey, now," Zoran said, "you leave Zulu out of this. He hasn't done any plucking since he arrived. Besides, you don't hear us complain about that Sabos fellow." "You, leave Sabos alone," Ina said, "he's a fine gentleman." "Yes, so fine that we watch all your knees buckle whenever he walks by with Her Majesty." Zoran ducked behind his chair as a cushion came flying his way. It bounced off of Amod's shoulder. Ina brought a hand to her mouth. "Sorry, Zulu." Amod wordlessly rose and retrieved the cushion from the floor, returning it to Ina's lap. "So," Zoran said, "what was all your griping about when we came in? You should know that those undead in the Northwestern Palace won't be leaving anytime soon." "It's those merchant girls running around pretending to be diplomats," Salacia said. "They're becoming more and more brazen." "How so?" Salacia cast Zoran an incredulous look. What do you mean by how so? They're trying to buy up our kingdom with their goods and services. Now, they're trying to influence our internal affairs. Our dear queen can only bow her head because they have our country at their mercy. They're rubbing their superior position into our faces with that whole benevolent act of theirs. We need to do something before our country is turned into a warehouse. It certainly felt that they would end up that way. The Sorceress Kingdom effectively had the power to do anything it wished. Instead of asking for some price in gold or some other reasonable form of payment, Countess Corlin and her 2 minions just kept digging their claws deeper and deeper in the Draconic Kingdom. I don't know what you think can be done in this situation, Sorul, Zoran said. You heard Her Majesty, we can ill afford anything that would turn them against us. If they leave and take their forces with them, that's it for the Draconic Kingdom. I'm not saying that we should drive them away, Salacia said. But they need to understand their place. At this rate, they'll be trying to lease Her Majesty by next week. You're exaggerating, I hope. You never know. We need to set boundaries. It was easier said than done. The nobles from the Sorceress Kingdom almost always kept to themselves. Corlin isolated herself in the palace archives while Wagner and Gonye disappeared into the city. Didn't you take Wagner and Gonye somewhere last night, Kaio? Ina asked. Remilly's place, why? What did you do with them? Eat? Well, it was me and the other men doing the eating. Wagner and Gonye simply enjoyed the experience. Ina narrowed her eyes. Zoran raised his hands in a disarming gesture. They just wanted to learn about the capital and a bit about our country, he said. Their questions revolved around trade, logistics and infrastructure. Certainly, they aren't as pleasant to interact with as, say, Salacia, but nothing was out of line with what they were or why they're here. How boorish, Salacia sneered. Can't they go for 1 hour without needing to discuss business? Better that they're with us than someone else, Zoran said. They're inevitably going to end up dealing with the guilds if they decide we have nothing to offer. I hate this, Ina grated. I hate being so powerless. If our territories were still working, we could at least put together something tangible. By the time we get everything running again, we'll be so far behind the guilds. It was so frustrating. The nobles and their subjects were the ones holding the land and rebuilding again and again and again. Merchants only came if there was profit in doing so. They were like parasites that fed off what little the people could manage before the beastmen came to ruin everything once again. Where was the justice in the world when such creatures could gain from the hard toil of the honest and loyal? Now, merchant nobles had appeared to do the same to the entire Draconic Kingdom. Zoradnik has already secured Blighthold and routed the beastmen in the northern province, she said. You make it sound like some terrible thing, Zoran replied, but that should be good news, I think. It is, Amod said. Ina sat up on her couch, throwing her arm over the backrest to look at them. Our troubles begin after that, she told them. It was reported that the civilian administration is non-existent. Zoran flipped around in his chair, crossing his arms over the backrest. What about the nobles? So far, nothing, Salacia shook her head. We don't know if they're even telling the truth or not. For all that we know, the undead could be butchering everything in their path and they've blamed the beastmen for it. Or they're just targeting the administrators and anyone who witnesses their demise to place us in a precarious position to exploit. I do not believe Zoradnik would do that, Amod said. On what grounds? Salacia asked. We were all there when she painted the halls red with the blood of all those beastmen. The powerful answer only to themselves. We, of all people, should know this. You never see a good and honest person in their number, serving the people. They are always adventurers, workers or engage in other similarly selfish pursuits. The weak cannot trust the strong, and the Sorceress Kingdom is a strong nation. That's quite the line of speculation you have going there, Sorul, Zulu said. If they are willing to go so far, why not just conquer us and be done with it? Her Majesty knew what they were trying to do and announced it to the rest of us at their first audience, Ina replied. Hegemony. They seek to be a power that determines the course of all other countries within their sphere of influence. You understand why they wish to do this, yes? Salacia came over from her seat at the window, leaning against a chair at the bar beside Zoran. It's the undead, she said. If a nation that cavorts with the undead embarks upon a campaign of forceful conquest, it will be seen as a mad beast that must be put down by the rest of the world. By establishing hegemony, the Sorceress Kingdom seeks to create a chorus of countries that will sing its praises. They will use our voice to endorse their acts of aggression and condemn their enemies, making everything appear as the will of many nations rather than the atrocities of an undead menace. Exactly, Ina nodded. This intervention of theirs is no act of neighborly benevolence. Their overtures of friendship are simply an attractive guise for their true intent. They are in reality conducting purposeful political and economic maneuvers meant to bind the Draconic Kingdom to the Sorcerer's Kingdom. Every move they make further intertwines us in their schemes. A ploy to draw us into a union with evil. Salacia grasped her pendant with an anxious look. They're attacking Her Majesty from every angle. Our kind queen always thinks of our well-being, and everything they do is an attempt to exploit that. As loyal vassals, we must come to her aid somehow. I do not like this. Amod rose to his feet. They are helping us and you reciprocate their actions with backbiting. This is far from upright conduct and unbecoming of Her Majesty's servants. Ina felt herself shrink behind her couch. Salacia similarly took refuge behind Zoran. The Scion of Eastwatch was a man of few words, but he was always imposing when he chose to speak. Many found it gallant when he expressed himself, but his temper tended to send everyone running. Zoran reached out to tap Amod's arm with his knuckles. Peace, Zulu, he said. I will not say that they are entirely correct, but they are also not incorrect to be wary. Regardless of their intent, the Sorceress Kingdom's delegation is making practical moves to bring us under their influence. If we let them walk all over us like this, we can only end up as their puppets. What counter-moves do you propose, Yorstin? If you plan to have us confront the undead, I'm afraid I must politely decline in advance. Her Majesty has staved off their meddling for now, Ina replied. She has decided to put together teams from the capital to help administer the liberated lands. We must start from there and secure as much power, resources and influence for our queen to use as possible. That sounds reasonable enough, Zoran said, but where do we find the staff for this? We are busy enough as it is here, so if there is no one there already, we'll just have to manage with what we have. The city administrators are gone, as are the guildmasters and senior temple staff, but many of the regular members of the guilds and temples have survived. My fingers are cramping up just thinking about handling all that paperwork, Zoran grimaced. How many of us are being sent to each city? That has not been decided yet, Ina told them. It stands to reason that those most familiar with each place will be dispatched. Zoran will most likely end up in Fallujah, for instance. Zoran nodded, crossing his arms and looking forward with an unfocused gaze. To be sure, this will help, but it's still a lot of work. Who else will be sent along with us? Clerks from the Merchant Guild, at least. Each representative will see to their own. Merchants with merchants, nobles with the people at large. It was mentioned that Heifert still stands, so there should be at least several hundred soldiers and officers to help police Blighthold and its territories. But that would leave Heifert unmanned, Amod noted. Zaradnik proposed that they stuff it full of undead, Salacia said. They want to take over our border defenses. We'll be prisoners in our own country with undead wardens watching us for all eternity. I would prefer to think that our wardens will be keeping the beastmen from coming in, Zoran raised an eyebrow. It isn't as if our people wish to escape. Yes, and that makes it all the more insidious. We are going from a pen being fashioned by the beastmen to one fashioned by the enemies of all life. Their initial benevolence will cause the people to happily exchange one for the other. Undead beings do not die of old age. They can afford to wait, and it will be future generations who suffer whatever they ultimately plan to inflict with their evil machinations. You keep asserting that they are planting the seeds for some dark scheme, Sorul. Zoran furrowed his brow, but there is no indication that they are doing anything of the sort. Everything so far has a clear purpose. There is no doubt that Countess Corlin and her party conduct themselves as merchants would, but that seems to be as far as it goes. I don't understand how you can assume that anyone who mingles with the undead has good intentions, Salacia said. Perhaps you've been fooled by their act, or perhaps blinded by appearances. They are nobles of a conquered territory. What else could they be but playthings of some undead monstrosity? Salacia shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself. Images of Corlin's party flashed through Ina's mind. Zaradnik was powerful enough to be seen as useful and courted as a military asset, but attractive young noble women were common. It wasn't impossible that the ones in Erantal had been rounded up after the annexation, and then Had they been threatened into compliance? Perhaps the vampires that they brought with them were once nobles themselves and served as an ever-present reminder that they would have their souls enslaved for all eternity if they didn't work to advance the Sorceress Kingdom's goals. Or maybe it was as Salacia suggested and they had been given to the undead, endlessly defiled by hateful beings that never tired. They would be broken, warped and twisted to suit their master's dark desires, humans who served as a pleasant-looking vanguard for the forces of evil. Your imagination is running off with you, Zoran said. They are humans just like us. They are the worst kind of human, Salacia shot back. Ones who have betrayed humanity. Coercion is not impossible, Ines said. As Sorul says, they are nobles of a conquered land. With no ties to Eranthal or its people, resorting to threats would not be strange. There is no shared history to cherish, no bonds of service or friendship cultivated over the years. All would be expendable. For what other use are humans to the undead? And since the Sorceress Kingdom's delegation is composed of merchants, Zoran stroked his chin thoughtfully, they would have been some of the first to bend. Kaio, Amod said, don't tell me you're taking up their reasoning in this. Zoran turned in his seat to face Amod, gesturing with both hands. Well, this version seems more rational than the arbitrarily evil characterization of before. First of all, why would a country resort to using merchants as diplomatic envoys? The North has tens of thousands of nobles to choose from. Furthermore, a force so powerful should already have diplomats of its own. Why use nobles from freshly conquered territories? Normally, Salacia came out from behind Zoran. A new power in the region would immediately send envoys to their neighbors. According to both our sources and their claims, the Sorcerer King pressed his claim to Eranthal during the annual war between the Riastais and Baharuth last winter. They've had a year to make proper contact, yet they've only chosen to do so now. So time to plan and prepare, Zoran said. The timing of their intervention is also suspect. I doubt the conquerors were human in the first place, Salacia said. They needed time to groom those women into representatives that they could display to the nearby human countries. A human face for a nation of monsters. As for their timing, I think you're right. They might have even gone so far as to interfere with the theocracy to keep us ripe for the taking. A beastman attack of this magnitude should have resulted in the theocracy sending their armies and the Sunlight Scripture, maybe a force even more powerful than that. The Sorceress Kingdom might have done something to keep that from happening. It was a disturbingly compelling point. Ina found it unlikely that anything that had happened could have been a coincidence. The fact that the Sorceress Kingdom sought to establish hegemony meant that they would have to confront the theocracy at some point. A war was being waged in the shadows, one that undermined the theocracy's national power and the influence of its temples. Now, the Draconic Kingdom was being dragged into it. How much did their queen know? What more would she allow and what lines would she draw? She had always skillfully handled everyone around her no matter what the situation was, but, this time, everything that was happening was so big. We need not worry about those things for now, Ines said. We must focus on what we can do for our queen and our country. Like Her Majesty, we cannot show any open defiance or belligerence, but we must also protect the sovereign will of the Draconic Kingdom. We have always had to curry the favor of the strong and rely on their power to survive, but now we have both the Beastmen and the Sorceress Kingdom trying to swallow us whole. Yorston speaks the truth, Salacia nodded. At the same time, we must be aware of what the Sorceress Kingdom's influence might mean for our relations with other countries. If things get out of hand, we may be cast in the same light as the Sorceress Kingdom. Also, once the theocracy hears of this, they will certainly move to regain their influence. How would they do that? Imod asked. The theocracy only comes when Her Majesty requests their aid. These undead are capable of wiping out tens of thousands of beastmen overnight and they will be present within our borders at all times. We will never have to wait for help to come so long as we continue leasing the undead. Zulu has a point, Zoran said. With the beastmen threat addressed and our national budget going to pay for the undead lease instead of that annual donation to the theocracy, they may even forget that we exist. I doubt that they would simply appear of their own accord offering assistance for a non-existent problem. The temples of the Six are still here serving the country, Salacia told him. They will inform the theocracy of what is happening when they regain the means to. If it happens, Zoran replied, then it happens. It still does not mean that the theocracy will do anything and it is not a concern for the present anyway. Being aware of how others may react to our situation in the future means nothing if we're all in some beastman's belly. In a side. It seemed that she had lost the chance to sway Zoran's clique for the time being. That still doesn't mean we can be short-sighted, Salacia said. We need to plan for the future. We don't even have a proper picture of the present, Zoran replied. Is it such a terrible thing to set everything aright now that the opportunity has presented itself? It's not, Ina told him, but, as I said, there are dangers in how we rebuild everything with both domestic and foreign merchants trying to influence our affairs. We need to keep them in line or they'll do as they please. Well, if what you said was true, we'll still have the military under us, yes? That should be more than sufficient to enforce order amongst the civilian population. Also, in the future, we will have people controlling the least undead, yes? Ina cast a sharp look at Zoran. Where did you hear that from? She asked. It was a mere suggestion presented by Corlin's delegation yesterday afternoon. Her Majesty said she would consult with Zaradnik over how it would work, but she never committed to anything. We just came from an audience with Her Majesty, Zoran said. She asked how Zelu felt about it. Who else was there? How did you respond? Wenwen was attending to Her Majesty. Sebastian was there, of course, but no one else. As for the response, it makes sense, no? Zelu is from Eastwatch, where the undead security forces will be needed the most. She glanced at Amod, who nodded slightly. Would it work to the Draconic Kingdom's advantage? It was better than allowing the undead to manage themselves, but it also meant further entanglements with the Sorcerer's Kingdom. What did Her Majesty tell Zelu to do? She just asked whether he was interested or not, Zoran said. Zaradnik has not returned from the north and there's hardly been time for us to do anything other than our work here in the capital. But Marshal Zelu has a nice ring to it, no? Zoran elbowed the taller nobleman in the arm. Amod looked down and to the side. He did seem well suited to military leadership, which also meant that few expected him to survive for long. Rumor had it that his father, Count Zelu, sent him to the palace to keep him from meeting a grisly fate on the border. I wonder if the temples have magical items that will protect you from the taint of the undead, Salacia said. We can't have you getting corrupted by their evil. And here I thought you'd be worried about Zaradnik ensnaring him, Zoran smirked. Why the difference in treatment between Corlin's party and her, I wonder? Because there is no doubt in anyone's mind that those who cross Zaradnik will be turned into yet another stain in the palace corridors, Ina said. Even Cerebrate and his ilk didn't give off the feeling that she does. She's more intimidating than the undead under her command, in many ways. Is that so? My first impression was that she was like Zelu, but with infinitely nicer legs. I think they would get along well. She frowned at Zoran's flippant remark. Well, I don't think Zelu would fall for her wiles, Salacia sniffed, but be careful nonetheless. She may try to lead you down the path of evil. Both she and Corlin keep trying to frame the Sorceress Kingdom's undead as harmless summons. The undead are the undead, and don't you forget it. As long as they are slaughtering beastmen, Zoran replied, they can be as undead as they want. Let's do as Yorston says and focus on what we can do something about, yes? Getting revenues flowing comes first, Ina said. Funneling all of the goods coming into the capital from the Sorceress Kingdom through the crown is convenient for taxation, but we can't say the same will be happening elsewhere. Supplies are already flowing into Blighthold and we have no one there. If we can't secure finances, we won't be able to compete with the guilds. Why not issue royal edicts to make sure everything that needs to be taken care of is seen to first? Also, it is customary to waive taxes after major beastman incursions anyway. We can't waive taxes for the whole country, Kao. Provinces that are victimized by the beastmen are supported by the other provinces, but we can't do that if the entire country has been ravaged. The crown needs money, both to run the government and keep the Sorceress Kingdom from taking more of our land. The door opened and Lena swept breathlessly into the lounge, her blue silk shawl trailing behind her. Her eyes went around the room once before she spoke. They're doing it. Doing what, Delaros? Ina frowned. The thing. Corlin came in for a late evening audience and asked for the Dead March. What? Ina shot to her feet, mouth aghast. They said that, Lena explained, since we aren't utilizing the land anyway, they would like to lease the Dead March for agricultural purposes. All of it. They're not wrong about the Draconic Kingdom leaving the land undeveloped, Zoran said. But there's a clear reason for that. I suppose with them being used to having the undead around, it seems like a waste. What did they offer in exchange? Options, Lena replied. More goods. More undead. A percentage of the crops and livestock that they produce in the territory. Technical assistance and labor for public works. Lena was the most in favor of embracing what the Sorceress Kingdom offered. Now, however, she had swung solidly to their side. News of the proposal would probably turn the entire court against Countess Corlin. Ki. Salacia held her head in her hands. Those greedy bitches have no shame. What makes them think that a foreigner can just waltz in and exchange goods and services for land? We need to stop this rampage of theirs somehow. I'm curious as to their rationale, as well, Zoran said. The offer of payment for the exclave could be seen as a supportive gesture, but an entire march is on a whole other level. If we lack the population to manage half of our territories, will they end up asking to lease half of the country? As I understand it, Lena said, they've structured it as a precarial grant so they see no issue so long as Her Majesty accepts the terms. Their only concern is that both parties receive fair value. A precarial grant. Salacia muttered, what age do they think this is to propose such antiquated nonsense? Ina collapsed back onto her couch, lying down with an arm over her forehead. In one hand, Countess Corlin and her delegation wielded stupendous power. The other offered a bounty that would twist and corrupt the souls of those who fell under their influence. They were like the reincarnation of the 8 covetous kings of legend, whose depraved desires ruined the world. This time, they appeared in the form of human women, but they were no less unstoppable through conventional means. Still, they had to try. For queen and country,